Hello everyone, my name is Jacob Pearson. Today I will be presenting on the legislative history of the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, or better known as ANILCA. ANILCA is a sweeping act of Congress, considered by some to be the most important natural resource and environmental conservation legislation passed in U.S. history. There is some considerable argument on other laws that gave more establishment to natural resource and environmental law, but some are considered considerably proud of this piece of legislation. The passage of ANILCA gave federal protection to 104 million acres of Alaskan national parks, wildlife refuges, and conservation areas. An additional 40 million acres of existing Alaskan parks and wildlife refuges were modified. As well, the bill saw more than 57 million acres of Alaskan forests that were designated as wilderness. Two issues were at hand that governed the debate over legislation that would eventually become ANILCA. The first issue was an effort to protect Alaskan ecological and natural resources for the public interest. The second was to protect lands for the use of sustainability for Native Americans. The effort to pass what would eventually become ANILCA culminated in 9 years of legislation or legislative efforts, including separate attempts by 3 different Congresses over a period that spanned 3 different presidential administrations. Protecting Alaskan lands for environmental conservation and public interest and for Alaskan Native interests had been a goal for several decades. Much of this can be seen in both the historical movement of environmentalism and a dramatic change in U.S. federal Indian policy. Thus, in 1971, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, or ANCSA, was signed into law by President Nixon. This bill allowed the Secretary of Interior to set aside land withdrawals for Native American use and conservation purposes. However, it possessed a sunset provision on all D2 lands, in which Congress was required to ratify the Secretary's withdrawals before 5 years after enactment of the bill. Rogers Morton was the Secretary of Interior at this time, and despite his continued pleas and testimonies before Congress, as well as failed attempts made by lawmakers, Congress was never able to come to agreement on the Morton proposal, setting stage for the debate to come. In January of 1973, congressional members began to listen to Morton, and 2 proposals were introduced in each house of the 94th Congress. These proposals were collectively referred to as the Morton Proposals. In the House, this was introduced by Democratic Congressman James A. Haley of Florida. In the Senate, the bill was introduced by Democratic Senator Henry M. Jackson from Washington. The Morton proposal was largely based on the Secretary's recommended land withdrawals, with regulation to be overseen under established conservation law. This was largely to be overseen under the established. This was largely seen as a push by lawmakers to enact on Morton's suggestions to get something done. However, these proposals both failed to gain substantial support by either chamber. A large reason of this attributed to the lack of a cohesive permanent program to protect the Alaskan frontier. Similar proposals were introduced and failed in the 95th Congress until the passage of ANILCA in the 96th. As tensions heated up in Congress regarding action on Morton's withdrawals, a new administration was elected in 1976. The new president, Jimmy Carter, and his Democratic administration began to take executive action claiming authority to withdraw the land under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976 and the Antiquities Act of 1906. In response, Congress began to reassert its authority to reclaim the debate, with the goal of passing comprehensive legislation aimed at regulating Alaskan lands under a permanent program. Thus, in 1979, two competing bills were introduced to the House of Representatives during the 96th Congress. These competing bills were the Breaux-Dingell Bill, introduced by Democratic Representative John Breaux from Louisiana and Democratic Representative John Dingell from Michigan, and the Udall-Anderson Bill, introduced by Democratic Representative Morris Udall of Arizona and Republican Representative John Anderson from Illinois. The Breaux-Dingell Bill proposed the protection of 128 million acres of land, designating 53 million acres as wilderness, permitted mining in wilderness areas, protected 7 mining areas in the Tongass National Forest, and would have opened up ANWR to oil and gas exploration. There was much contention on this proposal because of its land development provisions, much of which were seen as unnecessary by sponsors, who saw that existing law at the time permitted mining in wilderness areas. However, Republican Representative Don Young from Alaska, who supported the Breaux-Dingell proposal, insisted that allowing mining operations in designated wilderness areas was inconsistent both with law and the intention of creating a wilderness area. Given the amount of disagreement on this proposal, it is no surprise that it failed to gain support, even after amendment and debate on the House floor. On the other hand, the competing Udall-Anderson proposal, otherwise referred to as H.R. 39, which protected 130 acres of land and did not permit mining in wilderness or wildlife refuge areas, was, to the surprise of many, seeing much more agreement among the House members. A notable compromise included the establishment of a research program to determine operations feasibility of oil and gas production in ANWR. One of the stated goals of this bill was managing multiple values in a manner in which will permit utilization of natural resources where appropriate, consistent with sound ecological principles. The Udall-Anderson Bill would go on to pass an amendment at 268 to 157 in the House, and passed on a final vote of 230 to 65. As H.R. 39 headed over to the Senate, it faced considerable opposition in its present form. The Senate Energy Committee did not act on the bill until October 9th. When it finally agreed to proceed, it did so on Senator Henry Jackson's bill, which he had introduced the previous year. The final version of Senator Jackson's bill was reported out of committee on October 30th. Senator Paul Tongass, a Democrat of Massachusetts, was a lone dissenting vote. In response to the bill's passage in committee, Senators Tongass and William Roth, a Republican from Delaware, introduced a competing substitute amendment that convinced Senator Robert Byrd that additional time was needed for senators to agree on a passable bill. He postponed debate to the next session of Congress the following year. When that session started, debate on the bill was further pushed back until July 21st. Ultimately, beleaguered supporters of the bill became wary that anything would happen regarding action, until Senator Ted Stevens, Republican from Alaska, who was facing considerable pressure to kill legislative efforts regarding the bill, conducted meetings with staff and colleagues who were able to negotiate a compromise, becoming known as Amendment 1961. On August 18, 1980, the Senate voted to pass Amendment 1961 and voted the next day, 78 to 14, to pass what is titled the Alaska National Interest Lands and Conservation Act. As the Senate passed version of H.R. 39 headed back to the House, Both Senators Jackson and Stevens declared that they would not accept any changes to the Senate version of the bill. Despite this, negotiations between the chambers started immediately, but saw considerable decline through the month of September, and were completely stalled by October 2nd. Senators could not agree on the balance between land conservation and land and resource development. Representatives and senators from Alaska at the time were repeatedly concerned with the legislation's unique goal. It attempted to implement federal control over a size of land larger than the state of California. And naturally, legislators from Alaska wanted to make sure that ANILCA did not impede upon the rights of Alaskans to determine how their lands were used. Representative Udall, who sought to strengthen provisions in the Senate bill, introduced a compromise bill, H.R. 8311, that would have amended the Senate version upon it being signed into law, a particularly ingenious strategy on his part. He referred to this as a blueprint for a final compromise. However, we must not forget that politics always has a part to play in this process. Had timing on the part of congressional leaders been more prudent, a much different bill could have been passed, one that strengthened both conservation efforts while giving more respect for state sovereignty. But on November 4th, 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected to the presidency, carrying with him both dramatic wins in the House and the Senate, increasing Republicans elected the House and winning a Republican majority in the Senate. And lawmakers who supported ANILCA began to look at the future of this bill under this administration in hopes of coming to a new agreement that strengthened the bill's provisions came to a dramatic end. In a somber speech on the House floor, Representative Udall asked the full House to support the Senate-passed version of the bill, realizing that if they let the current compromise go, they'd have to start all over again with little hope of succeeding. Thus, the final vote on ANILCA became a somber occasion, passed by the House with a voice vote on November 12th, and signed into law the very next day by President Carter. The Alaska National Lands Conservation Act seeks to protect Alaska's exceptional natural resources, wilderness, and wildlife. It can be said that because of this bill, Alaska remains America's last frontier in many respects. One can go there and experience natural resources or the natural world in a way that is comparable to only a few remaining areas on the planet. The adoption of ANILCA doubled the size of the National Wildlife Refuge System, directs the Secretary of the Interior to manage wildlife refuges in compliance with the National Wildlife Refuge Administration Act, enacted in 1966 to establish further federal guidance on wildlife conservation efforts. ANILCA additionally designated 14 different areas as wilderness and does not provide for further mining development within these areas. However, it does contain several economic development provisions, including research for future oil and gas exploration and production, timber harvesting, and existing mining claims. In the end, one can see that ANILCA had a very impressive legislative history. Proponents never stopped working for this bill. The 9-year effort spanned both Republican and Democratic administrations and culminated in a bill that ultimately received overwhelming bipartisan support. With that, I would like to bring this presentation to a close. Here you can see reference material that I'm sure will provide for additional reading and discussion on this topic. I'm excited to see the case law presentation. I hope that both of these presentations will be supplemental upon each other, and I thank you very much for watching.